All right. Well, good morning, Damian.
Good morning, Alan.
All right. So we're going to be talking about Rules by Cynthia Lord, which I enjoyed. I enjoyed a lot. I actually kind of teared up at the end too.
Yeah.
Uh, well, because I thought it was a really successful book in that it also I liked the ending a lot because the
hmm
ending Cynthia Lord definitely she reached like a climax when Jason and Catherine are at the dance, but there's
hmm
still a lot of questions. There's no neat and tidy resolution with David. There's
hmm
no big like resolution. It's just he's living like Catherine and David are living their lives, and Jason continues to live, and they just move on, and that's what I liked about the narrative of the book.
Yeah, it's very much indicative of like our day-to-day lives, just like they
Yeah.
happen, and sometimes things are left unresolved. Um, yeah, Cynthia Lord does a really great job of like really weaving those aspects into it where I didn't feel like I was like really I obviously we were reading, but I didn't feel like I was reading. I felt like I was just observing a life in progress. And then, by the end, again, like you said, it's unresolved. But there is the resolve of, they reunite, they come back together at the dance, they talk a little bit and get some of the past argument sort of taken care of. Um, but and then it ends like I like to think of it as it ends kind of like the same way like your typical summer movie would end, where it's like we stopped being friends after that, and like, it kind of went into like that kind of montage-ish moment. But it worked. It was really good.
Yeah. And I was actually pleasantly surprised with how she used David
Mhm.
throughout. It wasn't really that wasn't the crux of the book. He was a important part of it, but
Right.
it really was Catherine's story. And
hmm
then we had a very like believable and nuanced portrayal of David throughout. Um,
Right.
I really enjoyed his character, and I like how I remember in class, Jill, a classmate, was also talking about living with a family member and how
Yeah.
with autism, how she felt it was very authentic. And I don't,
hmm
I personally don't have any family members who are on the autism
hmm
spectrum, but it did, from my experience working with individuals, it was really authentic, and it wasn't saccharine, and it also didn't it wasn't like melodramatic.
No, I was say I also do not have any family members with special needs of any kind. But I also work with special education kiddos, and I think one of the cool things was this was actually my third time reading this book all the way through. The first time was when I was in middle school, and in middle school we actually had Cynthia Lord come in, and we
Wow.
were able to like do like an author talk with her.
Mm.
Um, and I don't remember how that went because it was a little while ago. But I remember it being very cool because we got to talk to a living author and talk about the book, and after just reading it, and so that was really cool. And I remember enjoying it then. The second time I read it was actually just last year because once again um, we had the opportunity to have the author come in, and so I was working with my special education kiddos, and they actually read the book.
Mm.
So they read the book, and it was really cool seeing it through their eyes and their thoughts about what was being said and done and how things were portrayed. And it was funny because we have one I got one friend who uses a device to communicate. And so he like the minute Jason came into the story, he was like, ah. And I was
Mm.
like, yeah, dude, like this is cool, right? And he was so excited to see it, and like it was really cool getting to see their perspective on it as well, and like having them experience the book for the first time.
Yeah.
And then of course the third time was this time, and sort of taking it into the lens of, okay, I'm now going to become a teacher and
Yeah.
potentially be teaching students with special needs, and
Yeah.
like, what is that going to entail. And I mean, like we both said, we kind of already work in that environment already. We're just not the ones like leading the classroom. But I think, this book really, like, it stands the test of time at this point. Because again, I read it in middle school almost 15 years ago now, so like it's not a new book by any means. But I feel like it still resonates very well with the where we are today.
Which is impressive, especially in a field like special education, a book that does deal with disabilities or differently abled people. That's still it's an environment that's still changing. We're still, like, as a culture, as a community, we're still learning so much, and there's a lot of things that are developing, and it's not cringeworthy. It is still really impactful and
Yeah.
respect and feels authentic. And I loved the character of Jason. Maybe one of my favorite parts was, I put my sticky note in. Like, it's okay. It's like when Catherine and Jason, they're going for a walk, and she's been making him all the cues.
Oh, I love the walk.
Let's see. In fact, okay. So she's making cues. And she's saying that she has a picture of the bench with two people sitting on it. And Jason, he points and he says, "Where wheelchair?" Jason pulls his brows together. "I imagine you without it, like in your dream where you can run." And I love that because it's that kind of misrepresentation, which is often well-meaning, that in a perfect world that we need to, a disability needs to be fixed, that in a perfect world they wouldn't have that. I think even in, maybe this was previous material in our course, there was the controversy over, like, all these ridiculous cartoons of Stephen Hawking in heaven.
Oh, yeah.
Or I thought of this book the other night. I was watching this film. It's kind of a wry, kind of political satire. It's called Walker. It's about this American filibuster who was kind of seized the presidency in Nicaragua in like the 1850s. And so he's a controversial figure, but there's a scene early on where his fiance, played by Marlee Matlin, dies of cholera. And so the character Marlee and the character are deaf, and so she passes, and so there's an open casket, and Walker, played by Ed Harris, grieving, and he's speaking to his deceased fiance, and he's signing the whole time.
That's cool.
Saying, why I can't sign, but he's using it. And I thought that was so, it wasn't, no lantern was hung on it. It was so perfect.
It just was, yeah.
It just was, and that made sense. And I thought that scene with Jason, I loved that moment. And I mean, to me, that was one of the kind of real hot spots of the book. That was one of the real kind of emotional climaxes towards the end, as we're getting there, that sort of relationship that Catherine's learning from Jason.
100%, because again, it shows authentically, and I think it's done especially well because it's done through the lens of children, where you can have that more, innocent intent kind of thing, where like there's nothing malicious behind Catherine's actions. She's simply, oh, like in your dream, like I'm showing you like a depiction of what you told me, and thinking that was cool. But then Jason on the reverse side being like, yeah, but that's not it. I think there's more to me than that. Like, yeah, that's a dream I have, but like that's not going to happen for me. Like, that's not a reality. And so he gets upset, and then she doesn't understand why until a little bit later. But it comes across authentically. Like, it's not forced. It's not like his anger seems genuine, and like yeah, like I can understand. I can understand both sides of this interaction, and I think Cynthia Lord does a really good job of not like victimizing either side. Really, it was this is happening, here it is, Um, and it's super cool because, obviously she's living with David, and David's got his own set of things going on, and then Jason has his own, and like how she interacts with both of them and kind of like is able to develop her relationship with her brother through developing her relationship with Jason as well, and kind of understanding like, all right, like David's not something to be embarrassed by when he does these things, like, because there are several moments where she's interacting with the neighbor and she kind of shies away from like, all right, David, like, come on, like, let's go. And that kind of, I like you said, it doesn't end in a way that like she like is done with that forever kind of thing, but like she has an understanding towards the end of the book, like after her and David have that big blowout moment, um where things are okay in Catherine's mind.
Something that only really I only really thought about it maybe last night when I was preparing for this, was how subtle it is that Cynthia Lord sets up, because the thing is, I don't have a personal connection to any individuals with autism. I work every day
Right.
with with young men and women, but and sometimes I'll be at home and I'll think, well, oh, this is what I was thinking. So sometimes I work with a student, and of course it's always like, all right, keep your eyes on them, and we need to do all these things. We have all these protocols, and then sometimes
Right.
I'll see a kiddo in the community. I'll see him at Costco or at JC Penney. I'm like, oh, hey, how you doing? And that fact that there is that personal life, and for me to think right now, well, what's John doing right now? And that's the thing with the book is Cynthia Lord nicely places. She shows us David at home.
Yeah.
Seeing that side, while we're also, yes, we are seeing Jason in his personal life, but we're also seeing him there. It's the whole Jason and Catherine, they meet at that the clinician's office.
Right.
So there he is, he's at his services. And so there is that sort of like, we see both of those sides. We see his frustration with his speech teacher, who it's kind of that whole joke where she's shouting at him. It's like when you in movies when somebody shouts at somebody who is like English as a second language,
Yeah.
it's that
I
same
love that scene.
uh, and they like, Catherine and Jason have a nice little moment where they're both rolling their eyes. And
Yeah.
so I love how we see all those facets there. And that really that was really nice. And it's also, I think, reading it as, since we're in a graduate program for special education, I was able to kind of wonder or fill in the blanks about, well, what would the class day look like for somebody like David? What would it look like for somebody like Jason? The whole time, this was written 15 years ago, the whole time I'm with Jason, I'm like, give that boy an AAC, give him
Right.
give him a, what's it called, like pro loquo, like give him a key guard, let him like say anything he wants,
Let him figure it out.
yeah, because he's so bright. Or like with David, I'm thinking about in my classroom, I'm like, oh, totally, like that rigidity. And there's like the other, like early on, there's another quote where it's Catherine says the right answer would be maybe, but David only wants surefire answers, yes and no, and Wednesday at 2 o'clock, but never maybe or it depends, or worst of all, I don't know. And that's so,
it's so real.
that's so real. And I can imagine just working with David, going through a session, having like a nice visual schedule, the now next, and then after he works, I can imagine him bringing out those VHS tapes, holding some VHS tapes of like Frog and Toad.
Yep. And just having
so
it.
Yeah. So that I really liked. And I also, one thing I really, really liked was, so that last moment, I think it's the last scene where, because David's scripting, he's used all the Frog and Toad language, which is awesome because I love Frog and Toad.
Frog and Toad's great.
I love the one, there's one where they bury cookies because they're eating them all.
Yes.
One of them was like, Frog or Toad, they're like, well, we could just It's like, well, let's bury the cookies, but then we could dig up the cookies. But anyway, it's that sort of there's that tension where Catherine's parents say no, we need to encourage David to speak with his own words.
Mhm.
And Catherine has this bond. There's that connection
Mhm.
with the scripting. And that's a tension where that's a very real tension. I know that's
Yeah.
something where sometimes I've seen, it'll be in the classroom and aides
Mhm.
will, let's say a student likes just for me to go like chugga 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 chugga, and you want to do that, and then the clinician comes in and is like, what are you doing? Stop
You
that.
need to stop. Yeah.
You need to stop. He does not
Right.
need chugga chuggas. It's that kind of tension.
Mhm.
And like you said earlier, Catherine, she's very real. She's no malintent. She's a young person who has
Mhm.
very strong feelings and connections. And I like how there's no real resolution with that either with the script.
Yeah.
It's a very real part of him. And it's not something, again, it's not something to be fixed. It's just
It
part.
just is. I run into that all the time too in the classroom where like, you have kids who will script and like I think it's going back to that other thought of like, what are they doing right now? Because my kiddos are in middle school, I often think about, okay, what are they going to be like 5 years from now? Like when they graduate high school, what are they going to be doing? And that's like I like to think further ahead with that just because I'm like, like at this point, we got 11, 12, 13-year-old kids and, similar to the rest of the middle schoolers in the building, all just trying to figure out themselves and life and, the whole 9 yards there. And I think about, like what are we gonna like what are you gonna do? Like you see their personalities and you're like, oh man, like this is crazy. And you start to like come up with these like ideas and then like you sit there and you're just like for the scripting part of it, right? Again, constantly like, nope, need you to try again.
Yeah.
And then there are other times though where you just let them script because it's part of who they are, and then it's
Yeah.
just they get something in the script and they go and they repeat it for several months and then something new comes up. Um, and sometimes it can be fun to be like, oh, that's a new one, like and like it's like new to the repertoire. It's like, huh.
The one, I mean, I don't want to criticize too much, but that would maybe be my one of my few criticisms for the book is that the
Mhm.
scripts are so on the nose.
It's the same book and there's no other.
And it's also like when
Yeah.
he says it addresses perfect. It perfectly says it perfectly communicates. And there's oftentimes there is more of that kind of like there's more static in
Yeah, it's
the
yeah.
world. It's not quite as intuitive, or it's more intuitive and less like literal. But regardless, it still gets the point across.
I would say I think that's just the nature of narrative and the book. Like Cynthia Lord obviously is
Yeah,
she's telling a story and okay, what scripted quote can I use that's going to be best fit for this moment? And then
exactly.
kind of work from there. And I'm sure her and her editor worked like tirelessly to make certain aspects like that work. But yeah, I mean, in that regard, yeah, it's the narrative piece of the book. But I totally agree. Like there's more in a classroom setting, like in a general setting, you've got you know the script can jump between like five or six different things, and they can just go for forever. Like one student of mine, she quotes Moana constantly,
Oh, yeah, I bet.
and we'll just sporadically throw it into the conversation, and like a little bit of planned ignoring, and like if we're
Yeah,
asking her a question, like as this you go in and you go from there. Um, but I think you and I think have a kind of a unique perspective because we already are in a special education setting. Well, I don't know if all of our other classmates are, um, but I think so. I think we see that side of it already in an educational setting, where I'm sure going forward when we are the classroom teachers,
Mhm.
we will take those experiences and sort of shape how we do things and be like, okay, I remember how this was handled with this particular student, and I either liked it or I didn't like it, and you can kind
Yeah.
of tweak it from there and make it your own. And I think having that experience, I think, is super super important. Um,
So when I wrote my reflection, I
mhm.
focused on, and this is another sort of development that I had just last night while I was thinking about today. In
Yeah,
my paper, I focused on, okay, so if I was the classroom teacher and I had Jason, David, Catherine, how would I differentiate? What would I do? But who I
sure, yeah.
left out and who I haven't really thought of, I didn't think of Christy
Mm-hmm.
or Ryan.
Oh,
It
Ryan.
wasn't it wasn't until yesterday I was thinking and I was like, okay, those are also individuals to consider. And the contrast between those two. You
Mhm.
have somebody like Ryan. It's a more overtly malicious kind of I don't even I mean he's cruel in the way that children can be cruel.
I was like, he's poking
Um
fun. He's poking fun at something. He's like, oh, like he makes funny sounds. Like I can do that too. Like he's just like not necessarily thinking about how that
no,
could be hurtful,
no, he's
but
not.
just sort of doing it for like the attention of Christian because he thinks it's funny.
But then there's
And yeah,
somebody like Christy too, who also she doesn't see how it could hurt somebody either. And
right,
she's not somebody who's going to go out and be like, "Oh, well, I'm going to pull a prank on David," but she's willing to go along with it. And
right.
that sort of silent she's complicit, but not really understanding. That's very real. And that's also people like somebody like who has that experience, like Christy or
Mhm.
Ryan. I think sort of like an inclusion classroom or more exposure
Oh yeah.
um, could really benefit those individuals as well. And that's something I wasn't thinking about while I was reading the book. Like you said, I was kind
Yeah.
of it's a tight book. It's under 200 pages. It's a tight YA book, so it's like the narrative's rolling along. So
Yep. That was it. We're just going through. You
yeah,
follow Catherine and go from there. Yeah.
but on further discussion, there's a lot there
Mhm.
with those side characters, which is really nice. All the side characters. Um, I don't think Cynthia, like you said, Ryan and Christy, they're just kids, and I don't think
I think
Cynthia
it
Lord
works.
vilifies anyone.
Yeah, it works really well that they're all children because, again, there's none of that moment where you think to yourself, oh, they're doing this out of malintent because they have a certain belief in XYZ whatever way. They're kids, and so their behavior and their choices are learned from somewhere, and they've developed over time, and now here we are. But none of it is actively like hateful. It's just, again, it just kind of is. And then the characters corrected it is. I think one of the characters reading it through again that I went back to was the dad,
Hmm.
Catherine and David's dad, and how he's very into his garden,
Hmm.
and how Catherine just wants his attention, but all the attention goes towards David. And I think that's just, it's so interesting, like on like a psyche level, because you know mom and dad are, it makes me think about how, like we were saying, we only have our students for 6-7 hours a day for 5 days a week. Then they go home and they're with their families for the rest of their lives, like and it's interesting to see how Cynthia Lord portrays like the parents and how they kind of how they live with it and they cope with their son, um, and how that impacts Catherine, because again I think one of the conflict points for her is that she wants more attention from her family, and they're like, why does everything have to be about David?
Yeah.
Like I'm also here, and like that's just it's such a relatable feeling for I think any person at any point in life, but like especially I think in families like Catherine and David's, where a lot of attention does go towards the special education child.
Yeah. And it's funny because Catherine's mom, she's totally the parent who has, okay, my son, my son has, my son's living with autism. I'm going to research everything.
Yep.
I know what to do. Oh, we got 10 minutes left.
10 minutes in the call. We're good.
It was going to end. I'm going to research everything and we're going to do this. We're going to address the scripting. We're going to do this.
Yep.
While the dad, he is somebody who, well, maybe he needs to do things. Maybe he's late to get home because maybe he goes to the park and has to sit on a bench for some quiet time. Maybe he needs coffee before he goes home. He does his garden. So he's also doing things like
I got a sense from the dad. He was kind of the parent who was grieving in the sense of that that, and again like that anticipated loss there, and so he again he avoids and sort of escapes from his own day-to-day existence and does his garden, and then he takes David to the video store. He has a moment where he just kind of has a moment to himself and is allowed to be. And again, it doesn't vilify the parents in any way. They're both just doing what they think is best and handling it how they think it needs to be handled.
And Jason's mom, I
Yeah.
think I was a little worried, honestly, when she's first introduced. She's so fiercely protective. And I'm sure, I mean, I know parents like that too. Where they have their shields up.
Right.
But then there's a lot of warm moments with her too. And that sort of like she's guarded and sometimes she's scared and like I think what Catherine calls Jason.
Yep.
The mom is kind of like she
what?
wants to protect her son, and she's a little confused and a little.
She's like, why are you calling my son? Like, what's your motive here? Again, and that's that adult perspective of well, what's your intent here? And Catherine's like, well, I just wanted to call and like check on him, like make sure he was okay. Like, and I think that was at that point where they had just argued, and she was like, I just want to tell him I say hi and like invite him to the dance, and she's like, okay. Again, the characters feel lived in. They all feel like we're in the middle of their story. Like this is just a snippet of everyone's lives intersecting. And Cynthia Lord really encapsulates that, like these characters are lived in and they're not just static and on the page and that's it. They are living, breathing people around us, and they exist. They exist with pasts and they have experiences that make them do the things they do. And then from there, it leaves it open-ended at the end of the book where life will continue to go on for all these people.
Yeah. Do you have any final thoughts?
I think that's about it. I think, great book. Highly recommend to anyone, honestly, like, even if you're not going into education or special education, like just in general, a good read and a good, like a nice perspective building book.
Yeah. I'm curious about, I haven't looked up what else Cynthia Lord's written.
She's got several books like since this one. I haven't read any of those ones, but I know that she's got several.
Yeah. And I know we're coming up on time, but you did mention you were wondering, because I used to work with middle school students and now I'm working with students who are in transition. They're ready to transition into that next part of their life.
Yeah.
And I've done a lot of day trials at day habs, at other adult placements. And
that's cool.
That really opened my eyes. And to see, I was with a young woman and we went to one placement and you have individuals who are, in their 60s. They're It's so funny because, think of, you have a student loves Moana, scripting Moana.
Mhm.
I've been a man who they had to keep him away from the printer because he kept on taking DVDs of Adam West Batman, and like
Yes.
all these, like, Richard Simmons. One woman was just watching all the Richard
Oh,
Simmons clips, and it's like, it was just it was kind of wonderful, and to see, like, I don't know, it did help me
that's
to
yeah.
sort of contextualize, okay, how are the skills I am helping my students with, how are those skills going to be applied throughout their whole lives?
Yeah.
uh that was, and so that's even why I asked him, like, oh, what else has Cynthia Lord written? Because obviously it's a book, it's a tightly written YA book. She
Hmm.
can't cover everything, but I'm kind of like, well, how would she, what would she, how would Cynthia Lord address, like, adults living with
Yeah.
with a disability? What would David look, what would David look like as an adult? And so I'm
Yeah.
curious, like, oh, what else has she written? Because she's very insightful. So
Yeah. I don't know if there are any sequels directly to Rules, um, but I'd definitely be interested in reading a book like that, like reading a sequel like that. Where I was like, here's David 20 years later, like, and just like seeing where life is then in that snapshot moment. I think that'd be cool.
all right, so I'm gonna end the recording.
Sounds good.
All right, let's see.